Few claims about Nietzsche are repeated more often than this, that he was the philosopher of Nazism. The image is familiar, a thinker celebrating power, hierarchy, the Übermensch, contempt for weakness, supposedly providing intellectual justification for the Third Reich. For many people, this association is so strong that it prevents them from engaging with his work at all. But the claim collapses under historical scrutiny. Nietzsche died in 1900. The Nazi Party was founded in 1920. Hitler rose to power in 1933. Nietzsche never knew Nazism, never responded to it, and never wrote about it. The ideology simply did not exist during his conscious life. So how did the association form? Partly through surface similarities. Nietzsche's language can be harsh. He speaks of strength, rank, decadence, and the need to overcome herd morality. These themes, extracted from context, can be made to resemble authoritarian rhetoric. But resemblance is not identity. The deeper reason lies in appropriation. After Nietzsche's collapse, his unpublished notes and manuscripts fell under the control of his sister, Elisabeth Nietzsche. She was an ardent German nationalist and anti-Semite, views that Nietzsche himself had explicitly rejected. Elisabeth reshaped his legacy to align with her own ideology. She edited, rearranged, and selectively published his writings, presenting him as a prophet of German greatness. Later, the Nazi regime found this portrayal useful. Photographs of Hitler visiting the Nietzsche archive, ceremonial use of Nietzsche's name, and selective quotations reinforced the impression that his philosophy and Nazi ideology were aligned. Once established, the myth became self-sustaining. Critics of Nazism cited Nietzsche as its intellectual source. Supporters cited him as inspiration. Simplified narratives spread more easily than nuanced history. Yet serious scholarship over the past several decades has largely dismantled the claim. When Nietzsche's published works are read in full, rather than filtered through later interpretations, the incompatibilities with Nazi doctrine become obvious. Understanding those incompatibilities requires patience and context. This video will trace what Nietzsche actually wrote, what happened to his legacy after his collapse, and how one of the most influential misreadings in modern intellectual history took shape. The most immediate difficulty with the claim that Nietzsche was a Nazi philosopher is chronological. Nietzsche suffered a mental collapse in January 1889 and spent the remaining 11 years of his life incapacitated, unable to write or participate in intellectual life. He died in 1900. Modern political movements that would later culminate in Nazism had not yet taken their definitive form. The Nazi Party itself would not be founded until 2 decades later, in 1920. Hitler's rise to power occurred in 1933, more than 40 years after Nietzsche ceased producing work. This temporal gap matters. Philosophers influence later movements all the time, but influence requires transmission. Ideas must be interpreted, adapted, and often distorted to fit new contexts. The fact that Nazism arose after Nietzsche does not prove absence of influence, but it shifts the burden of explanation. If Nazis invoked Nietzsche, they did so retrospectively. It is therefore necessary to ask, which texts did they use? In what form did they encounter them? Who mediated those texts? What interpretive framework guided their reading? Without this analysis, the claim of direct philosophical lineage becomes simplistic. There is also the question of intellectual environment. Late 19th century Europe contained many strands of thought: nationalism, racial theory, social Darwinism, romanticism, anti-liberalism, that later fed into fascist ideology. Nietzsche's work interacted with this environment but did not simply replicate it. Indeed, he frequently positioned himself against dominant trends of his time. Chronology reminds us that historical influence is rarely straightforward. A thinker can be appropriated selectively, stripped of context, or combined with ideas he explicitly rejected. Understanding the relationship between Nietzsche and Nazism therefore requires more than citing isolated phrases. It requires reconstructing the chain of interpretation that connects his writings to later political usage. The timeline alone does not settle the issue, but it establishes an essential fact. Any link between Nietzsche and Nazism is indirect. One of the clearest points of tension between Nietzsche and Nazi ideology concerns nationalism. Nazism was intensely nationalist, grounded in the idea of a unified German people bound by shared blood, culture, and destiny. The state was elevated as the embodiment of that collective identity. Nietzsche distrusted nationalism deeply. Throughout his writings, he criticizes what he calls the Reich mentality, the tendency to equate cultural achievement with political power. He saw nationalism as a narrowing force, encouraging conformity, mediocrity, and hostility toward outsiders. Rather than celebrating German superiority, he often mocked German culture as provincial and self-satisfied. He admired figures who transcended national boundaries and described himself as a good European, emphasizing cosmopolitan rather than nationalist identity. Nietzsche feared that nationalism would produce intellectual stagnation. When a culture defines itself through exclusion and pride, critical self-examination becomes difficult. Dissent appears disloyal rather than constructive. This perspective is incompatible with the ideological uniformity demanded by totalitarian movements. He also rejected the idea that political structures should dominate cultural life. Great achievements in art, philosophy, and science, he believed, emerge from individuals rather than from the state. Excessive politicization risks subordinating creativity to collective agendas. Nietzsche's suspicion of mass movements further distanced him from nationalist politics. He viewed large-scale mobilization as prone to herd behavior, emotional contagion, and simplification of complex issues. While he occasionally used rhetoric about strength and greatness, these concepts referred to individuals and cultures in a broad sense, not to expansionist nation-states. In short, Nietzsche's critique of nationalism challenges the assumption that his philosophy naturally aligns with fascist ideology. Another pillar of Nazi ideology was anti-Semitism. If Nietzsche were truly a precursor to Nazism, we would expect to find hostility toward Jews at the core of his philosophy. Instead, the historical record shows something far more complicated, and in many respects, the opposite. Nietzsche repeatedly criticized anti-Semites of his own time. He described the anti-Semitic movement in Germany as vulgar, resentful, and intellectually crude. He distanced himself from it publicly and privately. In letters, he expressed embarrassment that his name was being associated with such views. He also condemned racial thinking as simplistic. For Nietzsche, culture and character were not determined by biological purity, but by historical development, psychological structure, and individual strength. At times, he even praised Jewish resilience, intelligence, and cultural endurance, describing Jewish communities as among the strongest in Europe precisely because of the pressures they had survived. This does not mean he was free of harsh language. Nietzsche could be scathing toward all groups, Germans, Christians, socialists, philosophers, and humanity in general. He did not write in the cautious tone of modern political discourse, but his criticisms were not organized around a theory of racial hierarchy or exterminationist ideology. They were part of a broader critique of herd mentality and moral systems he believed were life-denying. The contrast with Nazi doctrine is stark. Nazism treated Jews as a biological threat to be eliminated. Nietzsche treated anti-Semitism as a symptom of weakness and resentment. Where the Nazis sought purification, Nietzsche mocked the obsession with purity itself. Understanding this distinction is crucial. Selective quotation can obscure it, especially when passages are removed from context or translated tendentiously. Serious scholarship therefore examines not isolated sentences, but the overall pattern of Nietzsche's thought and his documented relationships with anti-Semitic movements. That pattern does not support the image of a proto-Nazi thinker. Richard Wagner was one of the most influential figures in Nietzsche's early life. As a young scholar, Nietzsche admired Wagner intensely. He saw in Wagner's music a revival of tragic Greek spirit, a powerful fusion of art, myth, and emotional depth. Their personal relationship was close, almost familial. For a time, Wagner appeared to embody the cultural renewal Nietzsche hoped for. But the relationship collapsed. Wagner moved increasingly toward German nationalism, Christian themes, and anti-Semitic politics. His later works and public statements aligned with currents Nietzsche had come to distrust: mass appeal, moralizing sentiment, and cultural chauvinism. Nietzsche's break with Wagner was not merely personal disappointment, it was philosophical. He saw Wagner's turn toward nationalism as a betrayal of artistic independence. Art, in Nietzsche's view, should intensify life, not serve political agendas or moral propaganda. When art becomes a vehicle for ideology, it loses its transformative power. Wagner's anti-Semitism was particularly repellent to Nietzsche. While Wagner framed his views as cultural defense, Nietzsche saw them as expressions of resentment, an attempt to explain complex social tensions through scapegoating. Their divergence culminated in Nietzsche's public critiques of Wagner's work. He described Wagnerian culture as decadent, manipulative, and emotionally coercive, appealing to mass sentiment rather than cultivating strength. This rupture matters because Wagner later became a cultural icon for German nationalism and eventually for Nazi ideology. If Nietzsche had remained aligned with Wagner, the case for his connection to Nazism would be stronger. Instead, he positioned himself in opposition. The break demonstrates that Nietzsche's trajectory moved away from the very forces that later converged in fascism. It illustrates his willingness to abandon even cherished relationships when they conflicted with his evolving convictions. After Nietzsche's collapse in 1889, he could no longer control his work, correspondence, or legacy. That responsibility fell largely to his sister, Elisabeth Nietzsche, and her influence cannot be overstated. Elisabeth held political views very different from her brothers. She was an ardent German nationalist and an outspoken anti-Semite. She had even married Bernhard Förster, a radical anti-Semitic activist, and followed him to Paraguay to help found a racially pure German colony, an experiment that ended in failure and scandal. When she returned to Germany and assumed control of Nietzsche's estate, she set about transforming his public image. She founded the Nietzsche Archive, which became the central institution for publishing, editing, and promoting his works. Visitors encountered a carefully curated presentation: Nietzsche as a prophet of German greatness, a thinker aligned with nationalist aspirations, a figure compatible with emerging right-wing movements. This portrayal required selective emphasis. Passages critical of nationalism or anti-Semitism were downplayed or contextualized away. Statements that could be interpreted as praising strength, hierarchy, or cultural renewal were foregrounded. The result was not outright fabrication, but strategic framing. Elisabeth also cultivated relationships with political figures who found Nietzsche useful symbolically. Later, this included members of the Nazi leadership who treated the archive as a site of ideological heritage. It is important to note that Elisabeth's actions were not necessarily cynical manipulation. She appears to have believed sincerely that she was honoring her brother's legacy, but her interpretation reflected her own convictions more than his. With Nietzsche incapacitated, there was no corrective voice. This period of editorial control shaped how early 20th century readers encountered Nietzsche. By the time scholarly reassessment began decades later, the nationalist image had already taken root. Understanding Elisabeth's role does not explain everything, but it clarifies how Nietzsche's work could be presented in ways that aligned with ideologies he himself had criticized. Perhaps the most significant distortion of Nietzsche's legacy concerns a book he never actually wrote, The Will to Power. After his collapse, Elisabeth and collaborators assembled notebooks, fragments, and unpublished notes into a single volume presented as Nietzsche's magnum opus, a systematic statement of his philosophy. But Nietzsche had abandoned plans for such a book. His notebooks were working materials, drafts, experiments, contradictions, exploratory thoughts not intended for publication in that form. By selecting, rearranging, and presenting these fragments as a coherent doctrine, the editors created an illusion of system where none existed. This editorial construction had profound consequences. Many readers encountered Nietzsche primarily through this manufactured text. Concepts like will to power appeared as rigid dogma rather than flexible interpretive tools. Nuances present in his published works were flattened into assertive slogans. Because the fragments could be organized in multiple ways, the resulting book reflected editorial choices as much as Nietzsche's intentions. Political interpreters found it especially useful. Passages emphasizing struggle, domination, or hierarchy could be highlighted, while qualifying remarks or alternative perspectives were omitted. Later scholarship, based on critical editions of Nietzsche's notebooks, has demonstrated the extent of this manipulation. The original order of fragments, their provisional nature, and the absence of a finalized manuscript reveal that the will to power, as traditionally presented, is a posthumous construction. This does not mean the material is worthless. The notebooks contain valuable insights, but they must be read as notes, not as finished doctrine. The distinction matters enormously when assessing Nietzsche's supposed connection to Nazism. An ideology can more easily appropriate a simplified system than a complex body of work resistant to reduction. In this sense, the editorial history of Nietzsche's writings helped create the conditions for misinterpretation. By the time the Nazi movement rose to prominence, Nietzsche was already a famous and controversial cultural figure in Germany. His name carried authority. His style conveyed intensity. His themes of strength, hierarchy, and overcoming could be selectively framed to support nationalist rhetoric. The regime did not need Nietzsche to align perfectly with its ideology. It needed symbolic legitimacy. Selective quotation provided that legitimacy. Passages emphasizing struggle, rank, and the critique of herd mentality were highlighted. References to the Übermensch were reinterpreted as endorsements of racial superiority. His attacks on democracy and egalitarianism were detached from their philosophical context and presented as political doctrine. At the same time, inconvenient material was ignored. His hostility to nationalism, his criticism of anti-Semitism, his suspicion of mass movements, and his emphasis on individual rather than collective transformation did not fit the narrative. These elements were downplayed or omitted. Public ceremonies reinforced the association. Hitler visited the Nietzsche archive and was photographed alongside Elisabeth. Nietzsche's image appeared in propaganda contexts as part of a lineage of German cultural greatness. Symbolism replaced scholarship. For many observers, especially outside Germany, this visual and rhetorical linkage was sufficient to establish the impression that Nietzsche had inspired Nazism. Few had access to his full works, and even fewer could navigate the complexities of his style. Appropriation often works through simplification. Complex thinkers are reduced to a handful of phrases that can be mobilized politically. Once these simplified versions circulate widely, they can overshadow the original ideas entirely. Nietzsche's provocative language made him particularly vulnerable to this process. Statements designed to challenge moral assumptions could be reframed as endorsements of brutality. Thus, the Nazi use of Nietzsche was less a continuation of his philosophy than a strategic extraction of useful elements. If the Nazis had engaged Nietzsche's work in full, the incompatibilities would have been difficult to ignore. Much of his philosophy runs directly against the foundations of totalitarian ideology. Nietzsche places extraordinary emphasis on the individual, not as a unit within a collective, but as a unique configuration of drives capable of self-creation. The highest achievements, in his view, arise from rare individuals who stand apart from the herd, not from mass movements. Totalitarian systems, by contrast, depend on uniformity. He also distrusts the state. Nietzsche describes the state as a cold monster, an apparatus that tends to expand at the expense of individual vitality. Political power, in his analysis, often attracts mediocrity because it rewards conformity and obedience. This skepticism towards centralized authority does not align with regimes that demand total allegiance. Furthermore, Nietzsche rejects biological determinism as a simple explanation of human value. While he speaks of rank and type, these categories are psychological and cultural rather than strictly racial. He is interested in the cultivation of excellence, not the preservation of genetic purity. The Nazi fixation on racial hierarchy and eugenics therefore lacks clear grounding in his published philosophy. Equally important is his critique of herd mentality. Nietzsche views mass enthusiasm, moral certainty, and collective identity as potential threats to independent thought. Movements driven by emotional contagion appear to him as forms of weakness rather than strength. Totalitarian politics relies precisely on such mobilization. Finally, Nietzsche's ideal of the higher individual involves self-overcoming, the continual transformation of one's own limitations. It is inwardly directed. It does not depend on dominating others or belonging to a superior group. These dimensions of his thought were largely absent from Nazi interpretations because they undermined the political message. Appropriation requires omission as much as emphasis. By presenting only fragments that supported their narrative, the regime could claim Nietzsche while bypassing the parts of his philosophy that resisted collectivist ideology. Perhaps no concept was more heavily distorted than Nietzsche's Übermensch, often translated as overman or superman. In popular imagination, especially after World War II, it became associated with the idea of a biologically superior race. This interpretation fits comfortably with Nazi ideology, but diverges sharply from Nietzsche's usage. For Nietzsche, the Übermensch is not a racial category. It is an existential ideal. The Übermensch represents a human being who has overcome inherited moral constraints, created new values, and affirmed life without reliance on transcendent justification. It is about self-transformation, not group dominance. Nothing in Nietzsche's description suggests that this figure emerges automatically from particular ancestry or collective identity. In fact, the emphasis on individual becoming contradicts the idea of fixed biological superiority. The Übermensch is not born fully formed. It is achieved through struggle, discipline, and creative revaluation. Nazi ideology, by contrast, framed superiority as a property of a race, something possessed rather than cultivated. The focus was on purity, inheritance, and the elimination of perceived threats. These are fundamentally different frameworks. Nietzsche also treats the Übermensch as rare. It is not a model for mass mobilization, but a horizon for exceptional individuals. Attempts to institutionalize it would undermine its meaning. Moreover, the Übermensch is inseparable from Nietzsche's critique of herd morality. It arises in opposition to conformity, not as the embodiment of collective will. By transforming the concept into a symbol of racial dominance, Nazi propaganda stripped it of its philosophical context and converted it into political mythology. This reinterpretation illustrates how easily complex ideas can be repurposed when removed from their original framework. Even after World War II, the association between Nietzsche and Nazism did not disappear. In some ways, it intensified. For critics of fascism, linking Nazism to a prominent philosopher provided a cautionary narrative about the dangers of radical ideas. For defenders of liberal democracy, Nietzsche's rhetoric could be portrayed as a warning sign of intellectual extremism. Simplified stories were easier to teach and remember than complex historical analyses. Meanwhile, popular culture reinforced the connection. Textbooks, films, and secondary literature often repeated the claim without examining the evidence in detail. Once an idea becomes conventional wisdom, it can persist long after scholarship has revised it. Language barriers also played a role. Nietzsche's style is notoriously difficult to translate, and subtle distinctions can be lost when his work is rendered into other languages. Selective translation can amplify this problem, emphasizing dramatic phrases while omitting qualifying context. There was also the issue of accessibility. For many decades, critical editions of Nietzsche's writings were not widely available. Readers encountered him through anthologies or interpretations shaped by earlier editorial decisions, including those influenced by Elisabeth's archive. Political incentives mattered as well. Cold War narratives sometimes framed intellectual history as a struggle between liberal rationality and dangerous continental philosophies. Associating Nietzsche with fascism fit this storyline, even if the connection was tenuous. Finally, Nietzsche's own provocative style contributed to misunderstanding. He wrote to unsettle, to shock, to provoke rethinking. Such writing resists quick categorization, but invites misquotation. Detached from context, his aphorisms can appear to endorse positions he would have rejected. Misreadings persist when they serve multiple purposes. Correcting them requires sustained engagement with the original texts, historical context, and editorial history, a level of effort many audiences understandably lack. Over the past several decades, Nietzsche scholarship has undergone a major transformation. Critical editions of his works, based on original manuscripts, notebooks, and correspondence, have replaced earlier versions shaped by editorial intervention. Scholars now have a far clearer picture of what Nietzsche actually wrote, what he intended to publish, and how his ideas evolved. This has significantly altered interpretations of his relationship to political ideologies. Most contemporary scholars reject the notion that Nietzsche was a precursor to Nazism. Instead, they emphasize the complexity of his thought and the extent to which it resists alignment with any single political program. Nietzsche is now studied as a critic of morality, culture, religion, and modernity, whose ideas influenced a wide range of movements: existentialism, psychoanalysis, post-structuralism, and critical theory, many of which stand in opposition to fascism. At the same time, scholars acknowledge that his work can be misused. His language is intense, his concepts abstract, and his style aphoristic. Without careful contextualization, it is easy to extract phrases that appear to support positions he did not endorse. This vulnerability to appropriation is itself part of his legacy. Contemporary interpretation, therefore, focuses on reconstructing the internal logic of his philosophy rather than treating it as a set of political prescriptions. Nietzsche is read as diagnosing cultural conditions and exploring possibilities for human development, not as advocating specific regimes. Importantly, this reassessment does not sanitize his thought. Nietzsche remains controversial. His critiques of democracy, egalitarianism, and traditional morality challenge deeply held assumptions. But controversy is not the same as ideological alignment. Understanding Nietzsche today means recognizing both the power of his analysis and the limits of its applicability to modern political categories.